Welcome to episode 13 of the Everyday Sens podcast. I'm Jack Richardson, joined by Brennan Parks. And Brennan, today we've got a couple things to get into. Nothing about ownership, though. Let's make a pact together right now. We're not gonna mention it at all. And it might be a little bit tough with the first thing we're gonna touch on here, but how you doing today on this Monday, June 5th?
I'm doing good, and now that you said that, the sale's gonna happen, right? Right while we're recording here, they're gonna announce a new owner, but
Yeah, that's the plan. That's the
yeah,
plan.
exactly. I mean, that's fine. That we'd be happy about that. We will pivot if that happens. So, no, but the ownership thing, get it out of our heads because I'm tired of it, and it doesn't even matter at this point because like the new owner's coming. We know that it's fine, whatever. Um, Today though, yeah, there's been a couple of exciting links to the Sens. There's been some insiders mentioning a couple of fits, and then with Pierre Dorion going to the media last week, he kind of got our heads thinking a little bit on maybe what his plan is for this summer. And yeah, we're gonna dive into that today, and then we've got a little segment at the end that we're gonna do. So yeah, I'm excited.
So one of those takeaways or things that we will discuss that came out over the weekend is the Winnipeg Jets. Their star goalie Connor Hellebuyck. We've talked about him before on the show, just because the Jets season ended, and as we do, we speculated about everyone becoming an Ottawa Senator. But with Hellebuyck now, Frank Saravalli from Daily Faceoff is not confirming anything, but mentions that the Jets might entertain a trade for him. He's got 1 year left at about 6.1, 6.2, I believe, on his contract. And he lists a bunch of teams. Frank Cervalli listed a bunch of teams that could be a fit for Connor Hellebuyck, and the Ottawa Senators were one of them. So obviously, like we mentioned, Pierre Dorion doing the rounds, mentioning they need to strengthen goaltending, but we've talked too about being comfortable with Forsberg and Sogard as a tandem, just on cost alone and everything like that. So we're going to talk right now. Let's talk about Connor Hellebuyck. Does he make sense for the Senators? And this isn't just the fit on the ice, because obviously a star goaltender makes sense for everyone on the ice. He's just, I believe, early 30s, like in his prime. He's in his prime, the prime of his career. He's going to get a big ticket in a couple summers probably. So you got to factor all that in, right? Any trade with the Jets is probably going to subtract from the roster the Senators have right now, if it's with the Jets or if it's with another team to get rid of cap. So in that regard, does he make sense for the Ottawa Senators?
Well, the weird thing with the Jets is that they don't really want to rebuild. I think that's kind of been their MO, is they don't want to enter a full rebuild. So ironically, trading, look at that mug for the people on YouTube. That's I like that mug.
Picked it specifically for this.
Caught me right off guard.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, Hellebuck, like, it would make little sense for them to even trade him because they don't want to do a full rebuild. Like, they should sign him if that's their plan. I think they should rebuild, but would it subtract from Ottawa's roster? Yes, because again, they don't want to rebuild, so they're going to want to get other parts of their roster filled. That's probably a Pinto. That's probably a Greg. I don't think Ottawa's going to trade their core players. Maybe, obviously, DeBrincat is the obvious one where it's, could you do a swap because that's money in, money out? If DeBrincat doesn't want to sign, it's possible. Would he sign in Winnipeg? I don't know, because if he's leaving Ottawa, like we talked about last time, that's most likely because of a personal thing and not wanting to live here. So Winnipeg seems a little less ideal for him in that case, but regardless of what is in the trade, I think, like you said, Hellebuyck is a definite fit on the ice. 30 might scare some people, but as a goalie, that's kind of their prime. It's a little bit later than a player would be. So I'm not too worried about that. If you look at Hellebuyck, though, through the years, like, he won the Vezina 4 seasons ago. He's been a top 5 Vezina candidate twice. He played 64 games this last year and 66 games the year prior. Like, he's almost playing the full season. And he had a 920 save percentage this year through 64 games. That's, like, ridiculous, by the way. He had 33.62 goals saved above expected this year. For reference, Ottawa's top goalie was Anton Forsberg with 2.94 and a 902 save percentage. So it would be like a far away upgrade on anything Ottawa has right now, for sure. The problem for me is money, of course. Like, Hellebuyck is probably going to cost you. And I don't love paying goalies big money. Like Bobrovsky in Florida, that contract looks good right now, but I mean, he lost his role in the regular season and he's being paid $10 million a year for like 8 years. It's just, I'm not really comfortable with that because, like you always say, goalies are voodoo. So Hellebuyck could come here and be like a huge letdown. That is a real possibility. It's just so weird with goalies and their trajectory. 8 years is most likely what Hellebuck's going to get just because he is a premium goalie. And he's probably going to get like $8 million or something in that vicinity. And that's a lot. That's a big contract for a goalie. Any goalie, even the number 1 goalie in the league, that's a risk because, my goodness, if you get stuck with that, even 3 or 4 years in, you're in a tough spot, right? So, would I rather Hellebuyck than DeBrincat, like 1-for-1 on the roster? Yes, because Hellebuyck is exactly what Ottawa's missing. But at the same time, if he's allocating a lot of that money, can you even replace DeBrincat with how things are structured? Like, it's going to be hard to find a replacement second line winger to replace DeBrincat if you have Hellebuyck there too. So it adds to the roster, but it also takes away from the roster. And I think you have to weigh those options and kind of what makes more sense for Ottawa and what, how they're going to be able to fill out the rest of the roster if they do pull off a big trade for Hellebuyck.
Yeah, there's so many different avenues you can kind of take, and obviously a lot of people just point right to an Alex DeBrincat swap 1-for-1. Not that the Jets would want him, but like I mentioned earlier, it would be a swap by committee, or not by committee, but you know what I mean? Like you'd trade something for Hellebuyck and then have to get rid of DeBrincat because you can't pay him. So for me, I think the Sens have about 15 million in cap space right now for next season, after the Smekal and Mountain Pello signings for next year, if they're on the NHL roster, all that. So for that, I think about it like this. So the two other RFAs that aren't named Alex DeBrincat that need new deals are Shane Pinto and Eric Brandstrom. And I think you can kind of assume they're going to take up combined no more than $5 million, I would say. They're not going to get 8-year deals, I don't think, maybe 3-4 years, but they're not both going to be making more than 3. So with that being the case, I'm going to kick a scenario here. If you're the Jets and you're trying to rebuild or / retool, you're going to be looking for players, excuse me, like Pinto and like Brandstrom, who are young and are cheap at the moment, and can fill into top roles. Like both of those players, I think, are playing, third line, third pair, but they could play higher. So if I'm the Jets, I think those are the two guys I look at. I look at those two players. Now, as a Sens fan, I don't want to trade them at all. And I think one maybe, or one, if you're getting Hellebuyck, yeah, I could swallow that. But both would be a tough blow to the depth of the team that you're trying to build up anyway. Excuse me. But like you said, the Hellebuck's a game changer. He would be an MVP candidate on this team if he's playing well. Like, he's been a Hart candidate before. He's won Vezina trophies. Like, these guys don't grow on trees, clearly, as we found out in Ottawa. Like, it's kind of a, these players don't come around very often kind of thing. And I know we said that about DeBrincat, and it would be kind of ironic. So the reason I just kicked Pinto and Brandstrom there for that money is because Hellebuyck makes 6 now. Brandstrom, Pinto probably adding up to about 5-6 of the cap for next season. That would be my swap, and then you can keep DeBrincat probably if you do that. So that's the only scenario I see where you keep DeBrincat and get a guy like Hellebuyck. But again, it would be a tough pill to swallow. Like, it would be that you just be losing a lot of depth and a lot of serviceable depth that can fill in when top guys go down. Because we know the injury history on this team, especially on the back end, like that top 4 with Chikrin and Shabbat, they're probably not going to play all 82 games. You need a guy like Brandstrom who can step in, play power play time when Shabbat's out, do all this. And again, like, are the Jets even looking for that kind of deal, or are they looking for a hockey deal? Like, it's funny because you mentioned that and I know, I'll go give a shout out here to Ross Levitan. He lives in Winnipeg, kind of covers the team on the side as well as doing the Locked On Sens podcast, and he's been a good, kind of sounding board for what the Jets are doing. And he says they should rebuild, like you mentioned, but if they aren't, then they're not going to trade Connor Hellebuyck, regardless of if he has an extension or not. Because if you trade him, you are immediately worse. Just like if the Sens get him, they're immediately better. So that's another factor to consider. But at the end of the day, it's a game-changing goalie. And there's probably, 5 of them in the league, and Hellebuck's one of them. So I would be okay with Pinto and Brandstrom, just because, like we mentioned, you have to make the playoffs next season. And the cap is expected to go up a lot more next summer. Only $1 million this summer, but a lot more next off season. That's where you can decide, okay, maybe we can't afford to pay Hellebuyck $8 million just based on what he brought to us.
For sure, yeah. And that's interesting that you made that proposition, because in my mind, it was just kind of automatic that if you get Hellebuyck, DeBrincat is gone. But yeah, if they found a way to move players like depth guys, third liners, third pairing guys, to get Hellebuyck, and then obviously there would be some premium asset in there too, whether it's a first round pick or whatever it might be. Like, I'd be pretty willing to do that, to be honest with you. Like, I'd be very open, even though I love Eric Brandstrom and I love Shane Pinto and they bring a lot to the roster. I'd be very open to acquire a top 5, top 3, even arguably top 1 goaltender in Connor Hellebuyck if it means trading guys like that. Because ultimately, if you can keep DeBrincat on the roster, whether that's, clearing the cap space that way, if you've got DeBrincat and Hellebuyck, this team is like ridiculously good. Even I know they'd have to fill in their depth, but on defense, like again, really like Brandstrom. I've been his biggest supporter for a while, but I would be comfortable with putting a Tyler Clevin in that spot if need be, if it means you're getting Connor Hellebuyck, right? They've got options, and then like the depth forwards would be a little bit rough without Pinto, but I think you can fill it in. Like I think you can find guys you can fill it in. And I think that Hellebuyck can just help bail that out. Like it's a huge factor having a goalie like that. And it's just, I don't know, like if they could really find a way to keep DeBrincat, I'd be super open to it. Because could you imagine the power? Like we talked about how, according to Byron Bader's process, the Sens have 7 stars. Like if you had Hellebuyck in, this team is unstoppable. They're on like a contender list already if they do that. So I think goaltender is the one position where most, not even Sens fans, but everybody around the league looks at Ottawa and kind of thinks they need a different goalie. Like they need to find a number 1 goaltender. I don't know if I agree with that necessarily. I think they can bypass it with what they've got, but at the same time, if the opportunity is there, and whether it's a Hellebuyck, whether it's a Carter Hart, like there are different options on the market where you could try a UC Saros, right? I mean, if you tried, and it would take a lot of assets, and the Sens don't have a lot of assets left, so it's hard. They don't have a lot of draft picks this year. Their prospect pool is rather shallow at this point, just because, they're breaching into that contender mode now. It would just be tough to part with that, but if you're getting a number 1 goalie and sustaining what you've got in your core and Alex DeBrincat, that would be fine with me. I'd be fine with parting with players I don't want to part with for that deal.
And we won't get into DeBrincat's contract situation. We did on episode 12. Actually, we spent about half an hour talking about all the permutations, as I put it, like with DeBrincat. And a big thing we talked about was arbitration. Because Dorian mentioned if they go to arbitration, they can get a 15% discount on his qualifying offer. I don't know if that's actually the law or if that's what the Sens would go in saying is like, we want 15% less. But if that's the case, that's $7.35 million per year on or not per year, but just for the 1-year deal for arbitration. So if he signs that, you can probably get away with keeping one of Brandstrom and Pinto and having a guy like Hellebuyck on the roster. Like that's where, again, the DeBrincat conversation is the biggest factor. And I'd imagine Hellebuyck wouldn't be traded until after the draft anyway, which is kind of the not formal, informal timeline that the Sens have with DeBrincat. So that again, he's gonna dictate everything. If he gets $9 million on an 8-year deal, probably not going to make it work with Hellebuyck unless, like I mentioned, the Jets are interested in Pinto and Brandstrom. But again, I'll just quickly mention about Pinto and Brandstrom too. When people are mentioning the Sens are cap strapped and they're going to be, DeBrincat can't make that much money, it's all assuming that Pinto and Brandstrom are going to cash in. I see a lot of mock trades and mock signings on Cap Friendly that fans are doing. And they've got, Brandstrom at 2.8, Pinto at 2.5. I don't know if, I don't think that they'll get that much money. I don't know. And that's the thing too. So look, you can debate all you want, but DeBrincat's the superstar. If you're the Sens, you've got to, if you're wiggling with $1 million and you got to dish that out to all 3 guys, you're giving DeBrincat most of that, and then the other guys can get the rest. And that's just the way it is. And DeBrincat's at a different stage of his career than those guys. Those guys are probably going to sign bridge deals that'll take them to DeBrincat's age. That's when they'll get their big deals. But I think that's the way it's going to be, and it obviously is, because Dorian said June is going to be consumed by Alex DeBrincat. So he's not going to go to DeBrincat and be like, you know what, I can't give you 9 or I can't give you 8.5 because we got to give Pinto 3. So you got to slide down to 8. That's not how it's going to work. They're going to negotiate with DeBrincat, have a number in mind, and then whatever that comes to, then you go to Pinto and Brandstrom and you're like, this is what we have to work with. That's definitely how it's going to go. So again, he's the domino that's going to affect everything. And if he can get cheaper, maybe Dorian's like, hey, if you sign for less than 8, kind of what a Cole Caulfield did, he just signed for 7.75 for 8 years today with Montreal. If you do that, we can go get a Hellebuyck and we can make a run here and become a legit contender for the Cup.
Yeah, a lot of it falls on Dorian. Like it's his negotiations, it's his ability to get DeBrincat signed, and that's a really good point you made, because this was always the plan, and you see it with other contenders. And I think people, especially for Ottawa, because we've been rebuilding for so long, but people have a hard time realizing it, is you get all of these really good young players, and DeBrincat is young. Like I think he just turned 25, or he might even still be 24, whatever it is. He's very young. You get these young crop of players, and then you kind of pick and choose which ones you're going to keep and which ones you're going to move based on what happens, because ultimately they can't keep everyone. Like, I mean, and that's not even just the core. It's like you look at a Pinto or you look at a Brandstrom who's maybe just outside of the core players who are like your obvious top six, your top four. And maybe those guys are kind of a cap consequence, right? They're kind of like a cap casualty where you ultimately in 2 or 3 years after their bridge deal comes up and they're in their prime and they want $6 million a year or something, like I'm just kind of estimating, but maybe you can't afford them. And that's unfortunate, but at the same time, you have your core signed, you have Alex DeBrincat signed. So you kind of have to pick and choose. And this is why it becomes so important for pro scouting to be good, is because you have to find those players who are cap effective, they're cost effective. Like you go on the market and you find cheap players. You can't afford to pay $5 or $6 million for a third line player most of the time if you have a really good core. But that doesn't mean you can't find a good player for the third line in the market, or you can't draft somebody who becomes a good third line center who, you know, is a two-way center and you're paying him like 2 or 3 million, right? So ultimately, like if Pinto prices himself out of Ottawa's range, then in the future maybe he leaves. But that's not necessarily the worst thing, because that's the goal when you draft and you get all these players who are good players, is you want to kind of pick and choose which ones are going to be in your core and then which ones you're going to ultimately have to replace. And it's one of those good problems where you have too many good players. Like you have that's what you want, is you want to have too many players where you kind of have to negotiate. And again, maybe a Pinto loves it here and he wants to stay, so he takes less money. We've seen that in other places, but that's up to him, right? I think that's a great point you made with everybody's factoring in, well, we can't keep Pinto or we can't keep this player if we sign DeBrincat, but it's like, okay, but you want DeBrincat, right? You want DeBrincat more than anybody else because he's going to be your 30, 40 goal scorer and your guy who's going to kind of carry the lineup. So for me, yeah, you kind of have to set priorities, and I think that Pierre knows that based on the way he's talked to the media. Is you kind of have to set the players you know you're going to keep and the players who you're going to try to keep, but if they leave, it happens, right? Like it's part of the business. So yeah, I mean, ultimately we come back to Hellebuyck, and I think he'd be a great acquisition. I think goaltending is one thing Pierre has talked about acquiring this summer, and it's somewhere to look. I know like Aiden Hill is also in the finals right now, had a great game there, game 1, and he's a guy on the free agent market who you could maybe get for a good price. Probably not after the finals, but there is some options. I wrote about it. I'll write about it again if they want to. But yeah, Hellebuyck's definitely the top guy.
Yeah, and just quickly for Hellebuyck, does I'm gonna ask you a quick one here. Does the 1 year term bother you? Like, is that a deterrent for you? And I've got an answer for myself, but I want to hear if you think you should stay away from it or not.
I don't love it. Like, I don't. There is some nerve with him. Like I said, goalies are such voodoo. I guess that's a good thing for the 1 year term though, because if he was really bad next year or something, you could kind of flip him or something. I don't know. The 1 year term is a little worrisome just because, like, it depends on the package. Because if you did trade the DeBrincat or something for him, and then he doesn't extend here or something, like now you're in trouble, right? So it does bother me a bit, but at the same time, it wouldn't be so bad that I wouldn't pull the trigger on a trade.
So I'm gonna say I disagree. Just that I think, again, I keep coming back to us putting pressure on them making the playoffs this year, because they need to make it. This core has to make the playoffs next season. But I'm looking at the Colorado Avalanche from last season, so 2022. They obviously win the cup, so it obviously worked out. And this isn't the case with every team and every team that goes for it. But they had Darcy Kemper, who was on an expiring deal and was a UFA. And the summer before, they traded a first-round pick and a top prospect for him to the Coyotes. Not a bona fide blue chip prospect. I think it was Connor Timmins maybe to the Coyotes. But anyway, it was a sizable trade. That's two pretty big assets in the Avs organization. They had Nazem Kadri expiring on a deal last season as well, and they won the cup. And both guys left, and the team admittedly got a bit worse going into next season. They didn't have the depth. They got injuries, and then they bow out in the first round this season. But my point is, in the cap world, and especially these last few years where the cap's barely moved up, you have to be willing to lose guys for nothing. And I've said this before about DeBrincat when I was, saying they should go on the 1 year deal, if anything, because they need to have him next season. And I'm glad that Dorian kind of mentioned that as an option. I think it would be the same thing for Hellebuyck. Obviously, you're not going to sell the farm for him if it's just 1 year, but it's a game changer, like I said. And the Avs had a great season the year before in 2021. They won the President's Trophy, and goaltending let them down in the playoffs. What do? They go and make a risky trade for a goalie who was pretty proven. Obviously not a Connor Hellebuyck, so it would be a different trade. But my point is, you got to just go for it, and you got to analyze what your weakness is. And admittedly, the Sens is probably goaltending. Just on paper, it's goaltending. And now they got to go and solve that, essentially. And if a guy like Hellebuyck's on the market, you absolutely have to go for it. It's just my opinion on the whole thing. I understand the risk, and how and how it could go south very quickly, but I don't know. I think the Avs are a good blueprint. It's like you got to be willing to lose pieces for nothing. Essentially, I think they did the same thing with Landeskog, and I mean obviously the injuries and stuff like that. But I think it was after 2021 when he was a free agent and he almost signed in Seattle or something. I think it was pretty reported, and then he re-ups and stays in Colorado, wins the cup the next season. So that stuff, it's just it's what winners do. They take gambles on players, build a winning culture so that they're not looking to get out of there as quickly as possible. That they want to have unfinished business and come back and stay with the core. Like I think that's like every cup team loses guys every single year. Every contender loses tons of good players every single year. It's just a matter of fact.
It is, yeah, and I agree. Like, I definitely wouldn't be deterred by the 1 year term just because you need to, you need to address the goaltending. You need to be able to take risks on winning for sure. I do agree with you. Yeah, like I said, I wouldn't be afraid to pull the trigger just because of the 1 year term. I think Ottawa is a little bit younger in the sense that they probably aren't a Stanley Cup contender just yet. Even with Hellebuyck, I'd say just the core, you'd have to wait at least another year or two before they're really a cup contender. But yes, you do need to start winning, and Connor Hellebuyck is your ticket to the playoffs. Like, he is your ultimate. If you need to make the playoffs, which Ottawa does, you acquire this guy, and you're almost, I don't want to say guaranteed, but you have a clear path to the playoffs. The only person stopping you and the only team is yourself. Like, there's no way, anybody else is going to stop them. So, with that, though, yeah, I think, do you have anything else on Hellebuyck or anything, or you want to pivot into our
Yeah,
segment here?
let's do a little pivot. Yeah, so we'll wrap up on Hellebuyck. Maybe it'll be more of a discussion, but it's fun nonetheless, right? Just talking about a top goalie being on the market. All right, so we mentioned we had a little segment here at the end, or not at the end, the middle here. We're going to talk about our three biggest takeaways. So three biggest takeaways each from the 2022-2023 season. Just this can be anything. It's not necessarily hot takes. It's just what we saw and what we thought after watching this team last season. So we'll go back and forth here, and Brennan, you can go first with your first takeaway.
All right, I'm going to start with the core is better than we thought. And I try to be outside of the box with these because we have hit on some of the more common things a lot over the last few episodes. So I try to go outside of the box. I said the core is better than we thought, which basically, like, the best way I can describe this to you is before last season, I wrote an article with bold predictions. And one of them was that Tim Stützle would lead the Senators with 75 plus points this season. And Tim put up 90 points. Like, he eclipsed my bold prediction by 15 points, which is, like, that is the best way I can explain this to you, is that, I mean, my God, Tim Stützle at 21 years old is one of the best players in the National Hockey League. Like, this core, I'm not going to lie, even Brady Tkachuk, a lot of people thought he would kind of max out as like a 70-point player, right? And he already hit 83 this year. He was over a point per game, right? Like, that's honestly no small thing that I think people need to kind of talk about more, because being over a point per game at their age is very, very impressive, and especially considering the Senators as a whole didn't even make the playoffs. So they weren't on this, like, powerhouse of a team, but they still put up a ton of points and produced individually, which I found quite impressive. And then obviously the core being better than we thought kind of is attributed by the fact that they acquired Jacob Chychrun. Before the season, I wouldn't have said that. I think now, moving forward, if they hadn't done that, I would have thought defense was a problem moving forward, I think, or maybe a concern, like goaltending is. Now that they've got Chychrun and they pulled the trigger on that, I feel a lot more confident about that, and I feel like the core now is, I look at it a lot differently than I did before last season, to put it simply. I mean, there's no more Zaitsev, and now you've got a Chychrun, so the lineup is a lot different, looks a lot better. But I just think I was really surprised by how these players took a step this year. I knew they'd take a step, but I didn't expect this big of a jump from the Stützle and from the Tkachuk, and like Batherson's maybe the only one in Shabbat who kind of stepped back a little bit. But even then, like, they weren't bad by any means. 60 plus points is still huge for Batherson. And then you factor in Sanderson too. Like, I don't know. I feel like last season, looking ahead to this summer, last offseason, I would not have thought that I would think so highly of the core right now. I thought that, I'd still be a little bit hesitant. I feel like this core is a Stanley Cup contender for sure in the future, just based on what we saw last season. I mean, I didn't even think Sanderson was going to be as dominant as he was. It's just everybody came together and looked amazing. And now this next season, I think people are going to start to see that around the league as well.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And honestly, I think this kind of ties into mine a little bit, just with the core. And you mentioned Tim Stützle. Like I had him at 90 points. I did a predictions thing for the top six forwards, and I had him at 90, and like I knew it was a little, or I think I said 92 or something like that, and I know that that's a little, it was a little out there at the time, but I think what we saw the first 2 years of his career, like he's an offensive player and with more weapons, and we had to bring it in Giroux this time this season. It was going to be a more opportunity for them to get points. So, um, on that note, I'm just my biggest takeaway is I don't know how to word it necessarily. It's just it's Claude Giroux. I want to talk about Claude Giroux, and I think my biggest takeaway was maybe just how underappreciated he is around the league. I'll say. And it makes me think like how many other markets have had these superstars who are their captains and they're underappreciated around the league, just maybe not in the sense about his skill and everything like that, but just everything else he brings, like his presence in media conferences, his his mic'd ups things where he's talking to all the guys and like his I think he just had this clutch factor to him this year. And I know I mentioned like the every goal he seemed to score was a highlight reel. He had a career high in goals this season. Like it just feels like he is like everything he does is good. And it's like, whenever he's on the ice, he never had a bad game, like I mentioned. Like just my biggest takeaway, I think, is just how undervalued I think Claude Giroux is. And honestly, to this point, I feel like he's not discussed enough amongst Sens fans. Like we kind of take him for granted, I feel like now, right? Like you mentioned Kachuk and Stutzla setting all these career highs, and it's obviously a common denominator is Claude Giroux. Like he was a huge facilitator for them at even strength this season. It was a great line, and I think just the leadership he's going to teach Kachuk, and he is teaching him. I know Brady's talked about it a lot already. And then Stutzla, like just the competitiveness that he's bringing out in him. I know I posted a video on Twitter. I think they were playing in Columbus towards the end of the year, and Stutzla was pretty frustrated. It looked like he was complaining about something to Giroux, and then Giroux goes back and sits down on the bench, and he's smiling. Like, and I know he's talked about Stutzla like this kid he's got everything. He's the best at everything. Like it's, I think his presence in that locker room is only going to be a positive thing, and and I think amongst other fans, maybe didn't appreciate that side of it when they signed him. Like it was more of a, oh, we got this all-star guy. And I think the biggest question was if he can kind of keep it going. And lo and behold, he did. He had a career high in goals, which is not something that was on my bingo card going into last season. So one of my biggest takeaways is just Claude Giroux and how impactful he was in every aspect of the game. Like he's a gamer. He's a gamer. And if that's infecting the core and impacting them, I'm all ears.
For sure. Like Giroux, we talked about just the numerous clips where it almost looks like he's a coach on the bench. And I mean, yeah, he put up a career high in goals. Like this is a guy who's 35 years old and he's scoring career highs in Ottawa, and that's truly spectacular. But his coaching, like I say coaching because he legitimately looks like a coach. His coaching mentality is very valuable to this core, and I think you saw him like working with faceoffs with Timmy as well. Just these little like intricacies of the game where other players and veterans you bring in, they might not do this. They might not be quite as focused on. And even Drew said when he came in, like he wasn't going to focus on, helping everybody else and everything. He made some comment where he was trying to kind of not set the expectation that he was just going to be a mentor. He was still going to be trying to play his game, but he was a mentor. Like he came in and he mentored everybody in that room. I mean, you could see him. And Giroux is so special too because he's this kind of humble guy. Like there was one clip where he won, like they named him the player of the game afterwards. They gave him the goggles and they were like speech, and he's like, no, I don't think I will. Like he just didn't give a speech because he doesn't need to. Everybody knows that he's such a special player, and he's kind of been underappreciated his whole career. He's kind of been on Philly, who hasn't been super successful and was kind of in the shadow of the Penguins and Crosby. But Giroux is a spectacular player. I still can't believe we got him. We definitely do take him for granted now. I remember there was a rumor like earlier in the year before free agency where Ottawa could be linked to Giroux, and I thought it was blasphemy. Like I remember making I did a jersey swap on it just for the heck of it, and it got a lot of engagement, but I remember thinking to myself, this is never going to happen. Like I'm just wasting my time here. And then it did, and that's just kind of the strides this organization has taken, is that players like that want to come here now and are willing to come here. So with that, actually ties perfectly into my next point, which is that the Senators kind of underwent an organizational change in thinking, which we expected, but it was really nice to actually see it, and that's why it's a takeaway for me, is they went from being a rebuilder to a contender, or like that mentality. They're not a contender yet, but they have the mentality that they're going to now transition into that. And it's been so many years of rebuilding, and eventually, you start to feel like they're just never going to stop rebuilding. But I think July 7th of last year is when they did, because they pulled the trigger on Alex DeBrincat. And they gave up, a first round pick, which had been their prized possessions for the last, 6 years. Now they've got Alex DeBrincat, and they're willing to part with draft capital. And they weren't, I think the last big name they acquired was Matt Duchene. And then you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like 2017, Matt Duchene was the last legitimately large name, maybe Matt Murray, but that's kind of I don't know if he's a big name. Duchene is probably the last big name player they acquired, and that was like 5 years or 6 years before DeBrincat. So finally being back to the point where we're willing to part with draft capital, and a lot of it, and valuable draft picks, like 7th overall is nothing to scoff at, but you're willing to part with that to actually acquire a proven star in Alex DeBrincat. And then, a week later, they signed Claude Giroux, like we were just talking about. And then, even acquiring Cam Talbot. No, it didn't work out. But at the time, that's a move that shows the mentality of, okay, like we're going to take the risk of trading Philip Gustafsson away, but it's because we want to win. We know we need to win now. So we're going to bring in a proven goaltender, right? And then now Chychrun as well at the deadline. Like they've acquired at least 3 huge names over the last calendar year, which is extremely impressive to me, because if you told Sens fans this 2 years ago, it would have been not even a thought. Like it wouldn't have happened. Nobody would have believed that was happening if we went back in time and told them this. So for me, going from, proving that they're willing to now make these trades and acquire these players who will actually make them into a Stanley Cup contender was very important, because I think we are taking it for granted. But like I said, it was something that you needed to see to believe, and Pierre Dorion has done that. So I am pretty content with the last calendar year for sure.
It's interesting that you mentioned those 3 big names, and like obviously we all know that they acquired them, but if any other team in the league had acquired those 3 guys in the span of, I don't know what, 10 months, I would have turned my head and been like, wow, that team is absolutely a contender for something at least, right? And I think that maybe speaks to us. We know the team, we watch them all the time, cover them every day, but maybe we take for granted too just how impressive this roster is now, and like maybe it's because of skepticism for other years that we've been excited, but this is the best team they've had since 2017. And I know that this 2017 team was really special and everything like that, but I'd argue that this roster,
I think
as
they're
constructed, they got to be better, right? Like I think
that team wasn't as good as their playoff run
No.
insinuated. It was a bit of luck there, but
exactly. Well, it was luck, and it was also they had like one of the best defensemen of all time
Yes.
leading the charge, like a 3-time. I'm saying 3-time because he's probably going to win again this year. Norris Trophy winner, and Erik Karlsson. But yeah, like it's the most talent this franchise has seen in quite some time. So on that note, I'm also going to go to my biggest takeaway from this season. Kind of is a little bit of a loophole. That my biggest takeaway is that the 2020 draft was elite for the Ottawa Senators, and we talked a couple episodes ago about the 2021 draft not being so elite, just based on the second rounder in Ben Roger and the other 3 players that they let go without signing, essentially. And then obviously the Tyler Boucher stuff. It's been a slow burn for that 2021 draft at best. But with that being said, the 2020 draft has, like, I don't know if they could have done better. Like so we're looking at Tim Stützle and Jake Sanderson, who are superstars. Okay. And Sanderson probably needs to take another step to be considered a superstar, but I think he'll take it. Travis Hamonic thinks he'll take it. So those 2 guys alone would make that draft a win. And we knew as that season progressed, as that 2019-2020 season progressed, and the Sharks kept falling off, you're starting to think, okay, this is one of the deepest drafts in years, and the Sens are probably going to have 2 top 5 picks. That was a special time, because I did not care about the actual Ottawa Senators team. There was no one on. There was Tkachuk and Shabbat, and that was it. So that whole season, it was such a buildup, and I know it was the same thing for the scouts and for the Pierre Dorion. And then COVID happens, and they have an extra like 5 or 6 months to prep for who they're going to draft. They find out in June that they're 3 and 5, and then they go to the draft. The draft in October. So that draft was so special just because of how unique it was. And then you look at the end of this season, they had Tim Stützle, Jake Sanderson, Ridley Gregg, Igor Sokolov, Tyler Klevin, and Levi Marilainen all in the lineup on the same day in 2023. And yes, it's because they're not in the playoffs. They can put the young guys in the lineup. But 3 of those guys at least were pretty regular in this lineup this season, which is just it's so impressive that it happened 3 years later, not even 3 full years after they were drafted. Just speaks to how you got to give the scouting department credit, obviously, and the development team. I think deserves a ton of credit because guys like Tyler Clevin weren't mentioned as, and actually all of these picks, I think, were scrutinized at the time by not just Sens fans, by scouting websites and by prospect writers and everything like that. Like, people had Tim Stützle ranked 7th. They had Jake Sanderson ranked 12th. They had Ridley Gregg in the third, fourth round. And they took all these guys very high with these very valuable picks that they deemed the 2020 draft was the most important in the rebuild. I think they mentioned that after the Carlson trade. And they hit an absolute home run. So like you mentioned with the core and Tim Stützle and Jake Sanderson stepping in, I think it's all about the 2020 draft. I think that draft, those players are going to be part of this organization or just in the NHL in general for a long, long time. Like a lot of guys, we haven't even talked about Roby Järventie, who's a guy who we think could jump in next season as well. Like there's so many players here who are going to have long NHL careers. And if you're a scout, that's all you care about. If you don't necessarily care that they play for your team, you just want to be able to say, hey, I was the one who vouched for that kid, and he's had 400 NHL games now. So really impressive stuff from the 2020 draft this season.
Yeah, and we talked about it with Jan Vuorainen when we interviewed him about how, like, Mikko Ruutu, Ottawa's Finnish or European scout, he had some good hits because, like, Leevi Meriläinen and was not even ranked. He wasn't even ranked as a top 10 goaltender in that entire draft, and they picked him in the 3rd round out of nowhere, out of a junior Finnish league, and he's already playing NHL games. So that's ridiculous. We'll just run through that draft quick. Like, you had Tim Stützle, Jake Sanderson, Ridley Gregg, Roby Järventie, Tyler Clevin, Igor Sokolov, Leevi Meriläinen, Eric Engstrand, Philip Daou, and Cole Reinhardt. And Engstrand is the only miss out of that whole group. Even Philip Daou, I believe he had 7 points or 9 points in 7 games in the AHL last year before he got a season-ending injury. He's actually one of my most underrated prospects. I thought he was one of the best prospects at the rookie camp last year. He really stood out. He was a 6th-round pick, and he was really good. And I have a lot of potential for him actually, kind of hosted. So Cole Reinhardt, as well as someone who Dorian actually name dropped, who could compete for a spot on the roster, and he was a 6th-round pick, the last pick in that 2020 draft for Ottawa. And that's it's only been not even 3 years, and a 6th-round pick is fighting for a spot on the roster. And the other 6th-round pick, Daou, is one of Belleville's better players. So it's that was an incredible draft right down to the last pick, and that's a great pick. I didn't even think of that for my takeaways. You went outside the box on that one, so credit to you. My last one I'm going to get into is consistency must become the standard, and we talked about this a bit on the members pod with consistency, but it comes back to I guess youth, not being as immature in the sense that you can't go on a huge losing streak in November and screw your entire season. I pulled some losing streaks just from the playoff teams this year in the East. I went through each of their game logs just to see kind of how their streaks compared to Ottawa. So I'll just go through them in order here. So you've got Boston. Their longest losing streak was 3 games. They had 1 3-game losing streak, which is ridiculous. They were an amazing team in the regular season. Toronto had 1 4-game losing streak. Tampa had 1 5-game losing streak. Florida had 1 4-game losing streak. Carolina had 1 5-game losing streak, and 3 of those losses were in overtime, so they still earned 3 points. And then they also had an 11-game winning streak right after that, so that makes up for it, right? New Jersey had 1 6-game losing streak, 1 13 in a row just before that. The Rangers had 2 4-game losing streaks. The Islanders had 1 6-game losing streak. So none of those, basically what that tells you is you can afford 1 4-game or 5-game losing streak, but anything more than that is you're in a tough spot for the playoffs because you're kind of screwing yourself over. Ottawa had a 7-game losing streak, and only 1 of those went to overtime. They had a 5-game losing streak, only 1 of them went to overtime, and they had a 4-game losing streak. So it was it's just consistency. It's a matter of not losing several games in a row, or at least if you do win 15 in a row after, because that makes up for it. This was kind of the discussion with Patrick Waugh coming in as a coach too, and I know what Ryan O'Reilly said about him in 2014, and I've got an article on Waugh coming out today actually, but O'Reilly basically said he holds you accountable. He's going to push you to be better so that these losing streaks don't happen, because if they do, he's going to hold you accountable for it, and he's going to make sure that you come out the next game even harder and better. And however he does that, he has his way, because O'Reilly really talked about how the guys wanted to play for him, and they did not go on big losing streaks that year because of Waugh's coaching style. So I don't know if it is a coaching thing, if it's just a young mentality maybe, but my takeaway is that November month really messed up their playoff hopes. And if you go through the games after November, they were among the best teams in the East. Like, they were really good. And if you just subtracted that month, they would have been in the playoffs. So moving forward, I think it's just imperative that there's no losing streak. There's no 7-game streaks in a row. Like, none of the playoff teams lost 7 games in a row this year. None of them. Like, that's a pretty notable thing considering Ottawa did and then missed by 6 points, right? They were right there. So next season, I think you can afford 1 4 or 5 game losing streak, but multiple, it really, like, it's a fine line to walk. You can't lose several games in a row on numerous occasions. So yeah, it's going to be consistency, and that's everybody in the lineup, right down to the head coach as well.
I like that one, and honestly, like, I don't know if we've talked about it. Just the consistency is building the. I think I mentioned Jay Woodcroft in Edmonton when they were still on their run there, and just said, like, he said, we prepare, like, from game 1 to 82 is all about preparation for game 83, and I love that quote. It's obviously referring to game 83 as game 1 of the playoffs, and I love that because you're not going to be the same from game 1 to 10 as you are from game 55 to 60. Like, you're going to go through stretches that suck. It's about limiting those stretches. No team is perfect for 82 games except for the Boston Bruins this year. And even they had a stretch of, I think, 2 or 3 games where they lost, 4 or 5 or whatever it is. But every team goes through that. It's about how you respond. And I think last November was so frustrating for the Sens because they were playing decent hockey. It just was like they got no bounces, and that's okay. And I would be okay, honestly, if the team kind of admitted that, like, they just didn't get bounces, and that happens. But they let it snowball, and we need players in Ottawa and a coaching staff in Ottawa that can motivate guys to get out of a funk like that. Like, find something. And I know it's way easier said than done. In any sport, it's so much easier to be like, just break through the get the monkey off the back, right? And anyone who's played sports knows that, like, it happens. In a team sport, you're going to go through personal slumps. It's just about, if you're the captain of the team, just talk to the team, be like, who's going to step up here? Like, we need a goal in the third. Who's going to go get it? It's got to be someone, and that's depth. That's everything. But yeah, I like that a lot. I like the consistency. I think that's the biggest key to making the playoffs, because in the playoffs, you can't lose 4 in a row because you're probably going to be out, like, that's just the nature of the game. And I like that one a lot. Now I'll just quickly do my third one. It's not necessarily a huge takeaway. It's more of I didn't take anything away, which is kind of the problem. And it's just about Anton Forsberg. And I'm an Anton Forsberg guy. We talked about Hellebuyck and didn't even really mention him. Like, if you have Hellebuyck, do you need Forsberg as a backup? Because it's a pretty expensive backup position now all of a sudden. But to me, I still have faith in him. The injury, the gruesome double injury to him, didn't really help, obviously, the confidence in next season, even though I still am confident in him. But it was just that he never really, like, grabbed the reins. And the same could be said for Cam Talbot, but Talbot doesn't have an extension here, so we're going to focus on Forsberg. Like, he just didn't really take control, and when it just felt like he was about to, the injury happens, right? And I legitimately think, like, they would have made the playoffs if he was healthy towards the end there. Not a knock on Mads Sogard, but it's just that I think my biggest takeaway is that the goaltending position is more of a question mark than it was last year, right? I don't know about you, but when they traded for Cam Talbot last year, because it was in a flurry, it was, it was DeBrincat, and then they signed Talbot, and then it was Giroux, or maybe it was a bit out of order. Like, maybe Talbot was right after Giroux. I don't know.
It was DeBrincat, then Talbot, and then the next day it was Giroux.
Okay, so I saw the Talbot one, and I'm going to be honest. I saw it, and I'm like, really? Like, I didn't think that they needed it necessarily. I don't think anyone was talking about, excuse me. I don't think anyone was talking about goaltending being a problem going into last season.
Well, because Forsberg was so good, right? Forsberg was so good the year prior, but like the backup though, right? Like, Gustafsson had a pretty bad year the year prior, so it was kind of a
but I mean, it wasn't as much of a topic as it is now. So my biggest takeaway is that goaltending is more of a question now than it was, which is not great. And they got to answer that question, and an answer could be to just roll with what they have. That's an answer. So whatever they do will be an answer. Yeah, that's kind of a small takeaway, I guess, but it's one of my biggest 3. Just that goaltending didn't really get solidified, and that'll be a huge emphasis point this season, because they won't make it anywhere if they don't have good goaltending with whoever it is.
Well, the unfortunate thing is if they do just roll with Forsberg and Sogard, sorry, And that could happen. Like it's probably the favorite to happen right now. I think it's more likely than acquiring a big name Hellebuyck or something. The unfortunate part about that is that the Sens are going to get no respect entering next season if they do that, just because the league does not like that tandem at all, and they do not believe in Forsberg. And yes, I do have a lot of nerves surrounding Forsberg because of the injuries mainly. I thought he bounced back all right this year before his injury. Like I just have his game log pulled up, and he was kind of unfortunate because Talbot was hurt at the beginning. So Forsberg was forced into that bad losing streak we just talked about with consistency, and he kind of lost his confidence, I think, and like he went 3-6 in his first 9 games, which were a lot of those on that losing streak, and he had a 9-8 or an 8.98 save percentage. I think it did kind of break him a little bit just because he like Talbot wasn't there, so he kind of had to play those games. There was no real choice at the time. And it just kind of went on and on with those 7 losses in a row for the team, right? It was just demoralizing. Forsberg did end up winning 4 games in a row towards the end, right before his injury. And he played a little bit better. Like he had a 9.39 save percentage in those 4 games. So, I mean, he looked good. It's just a matter of double knee surgery. Double knee surgery? I mean, my God, you can't, because I think the risk of re-injuring that is reasonably high. Like there's a reasonable concern that he might get hurt again, in which case then you've got Sogard and you're back to where you were last year. So I don't know. It's kind of hard not to acquire a goaltender this year just because they have like the risk is depth there.
Yeah, the thing with Forsberg that I like and what gives me confidence that he'll get through this injury is I think Dorian and DJ have both said like he's the hardest worker they've ever seen for a goalie, or maybe just in general, like that he works really, really hard. I remember looking at that in juxtaposition to Matt Murray, who was just always injured, and I couldn't help but think maybe a bit of a backhanded thing from the management and coaching, but it still rings true. Like he works really hard, and I do have confidence he'll get back from that. I understand the concern about it though. The biggest thing for me with Forsberg is I think Dorian mentioned, I don't know when, but he said Forsberg is always better in the second half of the season, whenever it was, even when it wasn't in Ottawa. Their scouts said that, goaltending coach said that. Um, so that's interesting. Like, if that's the case, you got to ramp. I think they mentioned they want to get him back in Ottawa, or if he's not here, like get him going at the facilities a bit earlier to maybe prevent that. But if that's the case, you just have to hope that they're kind of healthy in the beginning of the year so that they can split it, whoever it is. But like I said, if it's a Hellebuyck, is Forsberg going to play 20 games? Like, is he going to, because Hellebuyck
Could
plays
use
60.
that cap space too, right? Like
That's the thing.
Forsberg's making almost 3 million, so
Yeah, so that's the thing. Like, that's another question that we'll cross. But I am confident in Forsberg. I think the 9.39 in those 4 games, like, that's pretty good. The game he got injured was after 11 days off. Oilers were hot. Sens were just doomed to lose that game, and obviously he just gets this gruesome injury, which is not great. But I think I keep saying X factor. He's another big X factor for next season, and yeah, it'll be interesting to follow. So, do you want to just throw in your last takeaway here, and then we'll wrap up?
I already had all my 3.
Oh, perfect. I forgot I was last. All right, so that's good. So yeah, again, they weren't really hot takes from us. They were just kind of takeaways that we what our perception is of certain aspects of the game and for the Ottawa Senators, and I think those are good because we're gonna, I think, slowly throughout this month of June, when the finals wraps up, the draft happens, we're gonna start looking forward to next year just based on the moves they make and stuff like that. But for now, June is still a reflection on last season, and it was a bit of a roller coaster, as I'm sure all Sens fans know. So, Brennan, you got anything else here for us just as we wrap up on this Monday?
No, I think I'm good. I mean, what do you think about the finals here? What's your prediction?
Man, it's hard to bet against Vegas. Like I think they're just they seem like they're on a mission. Every year there seems like a team on a mission. To me, Florida feels like more like lightning in a bottle. And not that they played poorly. It was a good game until the third last night or 2 nights ago. And I guess game 2 will be tonight. So I am looking for Florida to bounce back a little bit. But at the same time, okay, how did you feel watching Mark Stone, just vintage Mark Stone there for that 4th goal to make it 4-2 Vegas in the third?
That's what I was gonna say. Is I can root for Mark Stone. Like, there's a lot of former Sens who I'm like, I don't want to see them lift the cup, really. But Mark Stone is one guy who I can adamantly get behind, like watching him lift the cup. So I'm definitely on Vegas' side there. Sorry to Colin White, but I don't think he's a prominent factor in Florida, anyways. So yeah, I'm definitely with Vegas as well.
Yeah, seeing Mark Stone win would be awesome, and it would be painful, but it would be awesome. So we'll enjoy that game tonight. So thank you everyone for joining here, episode 13. We'll see everyone on Friday, I guess, for episode 14 of the Everyday Sens podcast. And hopefully we went the whole episode without mentioning ownership besides the beginning. So maybe something will come in the next week. So thank you everyone for joining. We'll see you later this week.